Are people aware of the data they're giving you? If they agree to give you their data, is the benefit clear to them? There's times where I'm asked for data and the value to me is extremely unclear to them. And so a lot of times, the way it's done poorly, give us your data now. We promise we'll do something good with it in the future at some undisclosed time, and you may not realize it or not, but we promise we're going to do that.
What is the path to building responsible AI products? We have a special guest, Jess Holbrook, the head of UX research for Microsoft AI.
At Google, it was just really early on and really experimental. We had some of the first deep learning models. Meta is very as advertised. It moves faster than any other company I've been on. When I talk to people around the industry is that ChatGPT broke the norms for everybody. It just shattered what people were focused on, what they thought was possible, the rhythms of business, everything.
We discuss responsible AI, what it is and how organizations need a clear vision for it, data transparency, ensuring you're communicating appropriately, becoming one of Google's first user researchers working on machine learning, the philosophical differences to user research at Google, Meta, and Amazon, bridging academic research and the practical development of AI products, the paradigm shift that big tech is expecting AI to deliver, and why the last thing you should want is a user over-trusting your product. As one of the first user researchers working on AI products, Jess offers a deep and informed perspective on the challenges and opportunities of working with this new technology. He challenges organizations to build values into their products, unwaveringly and without vagueness.
The problem is a lot of it's not checklisty, and deeper than that, it's not supposed to be checklisty. So if you say, I need a checklist, and I say, no, what are your values? Those are two wildly different conversations, right? And a lot of our AI is intentionally reflective and intentionally slow and intentionally not checkboxy. And that is counterculture to a lot of things in product.
Jess Holbrook is the head of UX research for Microsoft AI. Prior to that, he was director of UX research for generative AI and responsible AI at Meta. And he got his start in human AI research about 10 years ago at Google, where he was a founder and lead of Google's People plus AI research group. Prior to joining Google, he was a UX researcher at Amazon and Microsoft. He received his PhD in psychology from the University of Oregon and a Bachelor's of Science in psychology from the University of Washington. Please subscribe to Design of AI, the podcast for product teams, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or Substack. We interview leaders and practitioners at the forefront of AI to help product teams navigate where and how to leverage AI.
Jess, how did you first get into the world of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I got into it by a bit of coincidence. I always like to say I didn't really care about AI before I started working on AI. And I clarify that because nowadays I work with people who got their advanced degrees, in the 80s or earlier, and they've been thinking about things for decades. But I was over at Google, and I was actually on the cloud team. So I was working on cloud as that was kind of exploding. And there was a new hire that came over and was starting to hire some people up to work in the machine intelligence group, or the research and machine intelligence group. It wasn't the machine learning group or the AI group at that time. And it was just a really small team. So it was an engineering and research director and about 10 engineers at Google at the time. And, it's still pretty true of you could do 20% projects. And so I 20%ed on that team. And then as a lot of those things happen, as I said, you know what, I think the 20% time I want to be my 100% time. And so I moved over, and to my knowledge, I was the first UXer that worked in the machine intelligence group at Google, like that particular group, not the whole research org or anything like that. I just moved over, and because there was no UX, there wasn't even any product or anything at that time. It was just me hanging out with research scientists and engineers and going to all their meetings, which was actually, I think, really critical to my foundation and how I relate to all the technology. And then we just started trying to build stuff with a lot of the really early wave deep learning models that were starting to work.
That is super cool. Okay, so, you worked at Google. You've since worked at Meta. You've worked at Amazon. How do they differ in terms of their philosophies and approaches to user research, experimentation, and AI?
Yeah, I worked on AI at Google and Meta, but I can talk a little bit about user research and experimentation at Amazon as well. I think that there also, it really depends on the time interval at which I was working at these different companies. At Google, it was just really early on and really experimental. We had some of the first deep learning models. They were mostly the computer vision models. The language was still kind of in the LSTM phase. And they worked. There's a lot of optimism and envisioning how these models could work and what kind of product experiences they could enable. And so we were doing a path to get there and these really big thoughts. And it's kind of interesting to see how much of it is kind of coming to fruition now. I'm not saying that anybody called anything, but because, vision is cheap, execution is pretty tough. But like we were kind of mapping it all out. We were moving at the pace of curiosity. So there wasn't this urgency or this frenetic energy that kind of pervades the space right now. And most of that time was pre-LLM. So we had hit the large language model era before I left Google, but we're still in like GPT-3 land, not quite yet 4. I was also in a research division. So, capital R, foundational research, and then see how that could be widely applicable across the company and across the industry. But we were always trying to work on products as well. Meta is very as advertised. Like it moves very quickly. It moves faster than any other company I've been on a lot. But it also exists in this moment where we're after ChatGPT. And, one of the things I've heard when I talk to people around the industry is that ChatGPT broke the norms for everybody. It just shattered what people were focused on, what they thought was possible, the rhythms of business, everything around it. One of the things that Meta is just exceptional at is this speed and execution. And so they were working very hard to move forward with the foundational Llama models and to accelerate the capabilities underlying those and then to deploy them throughout the platforms, all the while focusing on responsible deployment and being in a highly regulated situation. I think that's another really interesting thing to be at the forefront of a company that is very much the focus of a lot of regulatory efforts and considering that throughout how you work with policy and things like that. Meta also does an extreme amount of experimentation. So this happens on platform. They're very, very willing to try things, to collect data and feedback, see what's working, abandon what's not, and invest in what is there. At both places, user research still played a strong role. It has this rivalry, though. So user research, I really believe in both places, played a strong role focusing on what we do about, well, what do people care about AI? Not what do people who read AI benchmarks care about AI, or what do the VCs care about AI. It's like, how do people think about AI and what do they care about? And what do they want it to do for them? And then at Meta as well, we worked really closely with data science to really try to paint holistic pictures of how people are using the new AI features. Why are they using them? What do we want? What do they want out of them in the future? And so those really were influential in both places. But there's this gravity around the frontier models or the latest capabilities or this kind of obsession with the benchmarks. It's really hard to ignore in the space. And we're now in this space where we're getting the kind of mixed leaderboard. So it used to be like these huge step functions, GPT-2, 3, 4. If you move through, some of the earlier Google models from the early Palm to like Bard to Gemini, you're seeing like fairly large leaps for the Claude models from, and now it's interesting because and of course the jumps in the Llama models from Meta. But now we're seeing these mixed leaderboards where it's kind of like, well, we beat them on 4 out of the 5, but we didn't beat them on these 2. But when we did beat them, it's by 0.3% on something. And so it's interesting because people get really pulled to that benchmark and that one number. But I don't think that matters or materializes in the user experience hardly at all. And what really is starting to matter is this: how does a model that's in the right class of capabilities show up? And then how does it create a really great experience for people?
It sounds like over your career, you've moved from foundational big R research into quite literally crafting tools. What is that experience like, moving from imagining what would be possible to literally changing how businesses operate?
I personally love it. It's the best place to be. I don't really say that I have one foot in each world these days because I just came from a couple conferences, and so I'll go to academic conferences, but then I'll come back and be trying to work out tiny little product decisions. And so I don't think I really have one foot in each world, but I probably have like 1.5 feet in industry and like my toes and a little bit more over in the academic world. And I think it's the most fascinating thing because one is that there's never anything boring happening. There's always some hard problem to fix. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about big R foundational research people think, oh, that's the hard problem. Not all of them, but a lot of them think, oh, that's the hard problem and product is working out details. And a lot of the product people are, listen, there's a zillion hard things over here. You just have to make a model a little bit better. And, I've always felt like I'm in this third position, just kind of observing everybody and going, oh, that's how you see the world. To tie this back to user research, it just allows you to ask better questions, which allows you to get to better answers and better products. So when I try to stay close to the foundational research or the cutting edge or the thing that, oh, wow, that works, but does it scale? That allows me to see some of the product decisions in different ways and think about what some different possibilities are in more practical senses versus really, really vague ones. For example, when I try to read up on models that can perform inference, but maybe even going into training on device, that allows me to think a little bit more about what personal versions of AI and more device secure versions of AI could look like. And then staying close to the product is just huge because otherwise you kind of drift off into this land of, like I mentioned before, you kind of drift off into like benchmark land or like, but why are we doing this land? And so everyone kind of has to come back to the products and the way that they want people's lives to be better eventually.
Amongst your peers, though, I'm wondering where do you think we are in terms of the maturity of this technology? And then I'm asking because it's been a really hot topic with some of our guests about the amount of hype and the hype cycle amongst the academics and those who've been in this space for a decade. Where do they think we are?
I don't know where we are with hype because we're wildly overhyped and then wildly underhyped in some places. So we're just kind of getting it wrong all across the board. There's a lot of people who are making huge promises about what the technology can do and totally glossing over the limitations. But then there's other people that are in the kind of AI hasn't done anything and it won't do anything valuable crowd. And that's just like obviously wrong as well, like both factually and if you start to do a little extrapolation. And then I think when it comes to maturity, I like this question because it depends on where you think we are at this moment. It's funny to me because people keep saying, these are novel technologies. These are novel technologies. We really don't know about them yet. And I'm like, we do. There's a lot of people who actually know quite a bit about how they work at this point. And there are these memes that kind of stuck around from the really early days of deep learning that people are really kind of attached to and kind of can't let go of. So in terms of maturity, part of me says we're at like 1% right now. We're like not even close. And sorry, and I'm not talking AGI. I'm not an AGI guy. I'm not in that camp. I think we need multiple major breakthroughs. And then I also think you would need a better reason of why we would build AI in that sense, other than this kind of magical, it'll make everything great. But what I'm saying is if I look at the scaling laws and if I look at what we're achieving now with pretty early attempts, I think that we're like pretty early on in the maturity cycle. I try to be a realist with more of an optimistic bent. I mean, probably wouldn't be working in the industry if I didn't have a bit of optimism about the technologies and how they can be applied.
This Design of AI episode is brought to you by PH1, a research and strategy consultancy that helps clients build AI products that customers want. Contact them about product discovery research to answer critical questions about what to build, competitive analysis to find out how to gain an advantage, service and customer analysis to identify the best use cases and value drivers, and workshops and concept testing to validate what will work and to fine-tune products. PH1 has worked on products for Spotify, Microsoft, the National Football League, Dell, Mozilla, Bell, and various health and higher education groups. Bring in an expert to make sure your products and teams are focused on what customers want. Visit their website to book an intro call, ph1.ca.
You mentioned about how you have a couple toes dipped into academia still. I wonder because as user researchers within product teams, a lot of these people in these roles have kind of stayed away from that academic bent. And it sounds like it's really been quite beneficial to you in your career, continuing to kind of follow and stay in that academic stream at the same time. Is that something that you would advise user researchers right now to really stay more present with what's happening in academia as a way to pivot and be more lucrative in the AI space?
One of the things that I see people underinvest in typically is, and I should clarify this, because I actually think a lot of times it's partially academia, but it's more of the industry labs, is staying up to date on what is coming out of the major industry labs. And when I say that, I mean more about the computer science work than the HCI work, because I feel like we actually pick that up through other channels just fine. There are many more on-ramps today than there were 10 years ago. Not to be, old man Holbrook on the show or whatever, but like it's actually a lot easier to come up to speed on what's going on these days than it was. So one is, I think that people should understand the technology better. And the reason is because AI is a design material. It's something that we're going to craft experiences and products out of. It's going to be one of the inputs. And so it's kind of absurd for me to say, hey, I want you to design this thing, but I'm not going to tell you like what material you're going to make it out of. Or I'm not going to tell you anything about the material. Make me a chair. Okay, out of what? Well, it's this material called AI. Okay, is it strong? I don't know. Is it water resistant? I'm not sure. Can it bear weight over 200 pounds? We don't know. Like that doesn't make any sense as a person building products or designing products. So you have to understand the design material that you're working with if you want to design with it. And then one of the other parts that this current AI wave is really highlighting, especially for a lot of researchers or even product people, is just how does this relate to our business model? Because a lot of people are kind of getting caught in this. We need to throw AI on it. And it's a bit of, okay, like why? What would that do for our business? Like, do we need more people, focused in this part of the product? Are we looking to keep people on platform longer? Are we trying to expand into new use cases and new revenue streams? And I feel like that's very under articulated right now.
What's interesting here is I learned about you because I was on YouTube trying to find more information of what we already know about AI. And I came across this video from Google I/O. I was like, this is wonderful. They're talking about exactly the themes we want. And it was you presenting a Google Flights product in 2019. And everything you were talking about is still relevant today. There's still the same problems that we're facing today. So it's fascinating that you just said that right now we're trying to glue components onto existing problems without actually considering really what does the business and the user want. So when I watched that Google Flights video, it made sense that you're trying not to put the technology at the forefront. It made sense you're trying to understand what really jobs people are trying to use these tools for. It made sense why you're trying to differentiate the products in the way you were. What do you feel has changed since 2019? What do you feel hasn't really changed?
Yeah, and I want to recognize that Christy Fisher was presenting with me in that talk, and she's brilliant and excellent, and there's
And we're
great.
hoping to have her on the show too. And we've been
You
reaching out to her. It'd be wonderful to have her talk, especially about video games. That'd be so cool.
Oh yeah, she's awesome, and there's a great team behind that whole effort. The flights example, that was one of the reasons we chose it, was because it was so embedded. It wasn't like slap you in the face, this is AI. It was so much about, yeah, this is how it shows up, and just gives you a thing that you couldn't previously get that everybody kind of wants, right? And I should explain that case study and that presentation was really the launch of this thing we wrote called the People Plus AI Guidebook. And if people are really interested in learning more about a more people-centered approach to AI, I really recommend they go check it out. It's still up at Google. We wrote most of the guidebook in 2018, and it comes out May 2019. And so I've looked at it. I was like, I'm assuming we're wrong about a bunch of stuff. No, at the time we made it, we actually contemplated making it a physical book. And I said no, because this field is so rapidly evolving. If we make a book, it'll just seem terribly outdated in a couple years. And when we look at it, I would say there's three kind of big shifts since that happened. One is obviously the rise of LLMs, and like really specifically dialogue tuned LLMs. The second is the generative AI, and as it comes through a lot of the text to imagery, text to video, everything to everything models, a lot of the multimodality. And then the rise of responsible AI. If you look back at that talk, it's called human-centered AI. Responsible wasn't the broad term used at that point. That kind of comes later. when we look at what's in the guidebook and what's in that talk is, when it first came out, we said, if you are familiar with human-centered design, at least 30% of this should seem really obvious to you. Because that was a little bit of what we were trying to do. We were trying to Trojan horse human-centered design into this wave a little bit. And so I think most of it still holds. I think there's a couple addendums. One of the chapters in the guidebook is all about mental models. So when people use your product, do they have the right idea of what it can do for them? And do they use it, and does that help guide them through the product and get the most value from it? I think what we see in so many of the products, especially the Gen AI and the chatbot products today, is they're just wildly broad. And so there's no mental model. And so you'll go up to them and it's like, ask me anything. It's such a weird mental model of what is this thing and how should I use it? And so I think you're starting to actually see some success where people are a little bit more focused and they say, well, ask me about these particular things. And they help with onboarding really well through really clear, what a lot of times we'll call like icebreakers or examples of how to use the product. When I think about the chapter on explainability and trust, these are just massive now too, because now we have the LLMs and the generated models, and the explainability or the transparency is lagging. And we're kind of coming up on that, but people really don't know, okay, I put this prompt in, like, how did everything affect what I got out of it? When I was at Meta, we worked on this project called Imagine, and there's this really cool feature that shipped in April where the output of an image actually evolves as you're typing it in to kind of show you. And so it's helping with the explainability of, what am I doing and what's the impact of it? While I was at Google, the very first presentation I put together when we were kind of working on the early machine learning models and everything, and we said, hey, I think we're starting to notice some patterns here. And I think we're starting to get to a place of almost some design principles. And this is the 5 years prior to the guidebook. And the very first presentation is titled, How to Build User Trust in Machine Learning. And I've been thinking about that a lot because the very first thing we did was about trust. Like, we identified that as like the key component to this whole thing really early on. So we have mental models, we have explainability and trust. And then the other part where I'd probably add an addendum is the errors and graceful failure chapter. And the part that's really interesting here is the thing that gets all the headlines are the big hallucinations from the models. The like, oh my God, the hand with 6 fingers or whatever it might be. But I think the harder part with these models is the really subtle errors. So you can have an output and there can be an error or an anomaly or something it's not wildly and obviously wrong. It's just kind of like 10% wrong, and it's in the middle. And so I think that we don't really actually have a good way to spot those right now, and those can be pretty nefarious. And then I oftentimes think of like the way we opened the People Plus AI guidebook. The very first thing we told people to do is just ask, should I use AI at all? Like, does the thing I'm using actually need it at all? And I think everyone kind of skips that part. But that is always the biggest question to ask.
Still relevant.
Still relevant. Yeah.
Now, this point of view concept is something interesting because it kind of bleeds into where we want to go with this, which is over the last couple of months, there's been a ton of announcements of new technologies, new use cases, et cetera, from Google, OpenAI, Meta, everybody's been launching something new. But from a consumer standpoint, and I just finished up a consumer research project, they don't know the difference. They quite literally cannot differentiate what these different bots do. They don't seem to have a point of view that's differentiated. They all seem to be trying to do the same thing. And when you ask them, well, what's one better at the other? Almost always it seems to be the illusion that whatever the brand created in some respect. So for better or worse, it seems like these big corps are investing so much into their future, but that they're all going to the same destination. Do you think that ultimately their end goal is to distinguish each other, or do you think that they're all just running the same race?
Yeah, I think there's 2 potential things that might be going on here, or where people think they're headed. I think this actually gets back to the maturity question, or the kind of question of like, where are we in the curve? So there's a not insignificant amount of people that have the point of view that this will be very winner take all. meaning you will have this one AI that you kind of interact with for everything, and it will sit on top of the existing layers in the stack, and whoever controls that is the winner. And there's going to be one, and it's going to be worth more than the other platform shifts before. So everyone's job is to do anything you can to be the winner of that. The other one is to say, no, there won't be this kind of layer on top, because actually that doesn't make a ton of sense in a lot of scenarios. I'm a chatbot. I don't know what the term is. I'm not a maximalist. I'm not a minimalist. I'm more of like, it will play a role. We're over chatbotted right now. I don't want to talk to my computer all the time. That sounds terrible. I love buttons. I love to be able to tap something and get a disproportionate output for my input. That's great. And I'd like those to stay around. And so then I think the other part will be the people who are able to integrate it into their existing products and platforms. One of the things we're not seeing a ton of yet, and this usually comes from the new companies, is the brand new experience that's native to the platform. So, when we have them move from desktop to web to mobile, and then to cloud, you see a lot of companies that really do well. They're able to embrace the new platform in a native way, where all the incumbents try to kind of make it part of their existing offering, or they just try to make an extension of the previous platform. And so when I look at that, to bring it back to that previous answer, when I come to a chatbot, right, and it's like, ask me anything, I can do anything, whatever, I think that there's two actually points of view that represents. One is that this idea of like, we will get to the one Uber chatbot that you will ask anything and it'll do it for you. And then the other one is just a lack of imagination, where it's like, I don't know what to do, so ask me anything. Like, we're not sure what this is for yet. But I think that, one of the things, again, I feel like ChatGPT is a demo that broke product thinking. Like, you got to remember, ChatGPT was a web demo of a really cool technology, and it seemed to break everyone's mind around how to design products. And it has for about 18 months now. And I think we'll come out of that. And we're starting to come out of it. I'm starting to see some examples of that. But it really just said, what if we had, a chatbot in the middle, maybe some icebreakers above or below it. We're going to have, a conversation history on the left-hand column, and you're going to have one canonical thread in the middle. And it's just a very odd paradigm, and I don't think it'll last. But we're just very demo anchored right now. And it's amazing to see how a demo completely disrupted product thinking across the industry.
Remarkable, because ChatGPT just looks like an access point to a new pipe of information. It's trying to replace the analogy from 1997 of Google, but it's nothing new, for better or worse. It's just trying to do it a little bit better. So what is that next evolutionary step forward? And I think we're all waiting to see it. And I'm sure you might have glimpsed at it. I don't know how much you can share on what those potential futures might or might not be.
I think that it will happen through these deeper integrations. One of the ways I've been thinking about it is, what are the new interaction primitives we're starting to see, and what do they enable? And so, just for anyone listening, if you're not familiar with interaction primitives, these are just like the basic ways that you might interact with a new platform or new technology, and they kind of become really pervasive. So like one of the canonical examples is pinch zoom. So you don't have pinch zoom until you have direct manipulation. You don't have direct manipulation until you have a screen that can sense multiple interaction points. And so you have a new platform and you have new capabilities that allow a new interaction primitive. You can think of things like just literally tapping buttons, like long pressing, things like that are interaction primitives. And those are really typically tied to platform shifts. And so one of the ways I'm trying to think about this is, what are the new interaction primitives that we're starting to see emerge? And what can those tell us about what maybe the new experiences will be? And there's a couple that I see emerging already. One is communicating intent. So one of the things the models, because they have the compression and the representation of language, is you can formulate much more broad and open-ended requests to them. You don't have to do as much specification as you do with previous paradigms. And the most specific you ever have to get is with code and command line and things like that. We've kind of been moving up in abstraction to where now the models, you can give them a fairly general intent, and they can get much closer to what you want than previously. So one is communicating intent. A second is, I think people are really undervaluing this format translation, meaning, again, because they have this representation, they're able to move things from, I want this as words, to I want it in a table, to I want you to do analysis on it, to I want it in code, to I want it as an image. And so this ability to really flow between formats, I think is really going to be big and important. I don't know what the timeline is, but I do think it will seem quaint at some point that we had to remember how to move between apps or websites or translate things. That will mostly go away as I can kind of combine that with the communicating intent, right? Okay, move this over to the Design for AI folder for me, or whatever it might be, and change these notes into formatting with to-dos and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, I can take this audio, I can turn it into text, I can then put it in the right location for you, and then maybe I can do some analysis on it, and with pretty small intent. So you can communicate intent, you can translate between formats really easily. And then I think this is kind of a form of translation, but this expansion and contraction is really big. It seems a little bit like a parlor trick right now, but it's going to be really big. And that's the ability to take content and expand it from where it is. And so this can be, take these bullet points and make an email out of it, or this can be outpainting with computer vision models or whatever it might be, and make it bigger, expand it. It's kind of the like more meme that hit, a little while ago. And then the contraction. And so take this thing that's quite long for me to read and shrink it down and know about the parts that I'm going to find really interesting or represent it visually to me. I'm extremely interested in something that, diagram this for me. Like, okay, there's multiple paragraphs, especially, if I'm nerding out a bit and reading, an old text, right? Like, this is kind of random, but when I was in grad school, I got to visit a retiring emeritus professor, and I have some of his old books on statistics, and I love them. And they're like some of my cherished possessions. But there's barely a diagram in the whole thing because, they're from the 1930s or something like that. And so I would love to be able to take that and say, okay, but represent this to me in equations and in diagrams. So this expansion and contraction at different levels, I think is really important, and is just going to be a primitive of these. To put a point on it, we haven't had that ability. Like, we've kind of been stuck with the quantity and the particular expression of something, of almost all formats of content up until this point. So we have communicating intent, format translation, expansion and contraction. And the fourth that I see that's really emerging is remixing. You see this a lot in the image space. Give me something, but let me twist it. Show me a picture of a celebrity, but make it anime or something like that. And it seems kind of like a toy thing right now. But the ability to just bump these concepts together and get an output just is like fundamental to the technology. And I think that we're actually seeing a lot of traction there already. And so the ability to remix, or for me to put a little flavor or style on any kind of text or video or imagery or whatever, I think will just become a primitive. And again, it will seem quaint that at one point we came across something and we couldn't participate.
Your world has also revolved around researching responsible AI. So you mentioned that a lot sort of at the beginning of the conversation, and around data transparency. Can you help the designers and the product teams that are listening to this right now understand how those two pillars, so responsible AI and data transparency, factor into how they should create a product?
They're both really challenging, and they can seem almost in some ways bigger than just how do I incorporate AI into my product. Because there's actually a lot of support and frameworks and content for incorporating AI in some way. I'll kind of talk about each, but kind of start with a little bit of at least how I define them. The way I think about responsible AI, it's a very broad term that means different things to very different people. And there are aspects of it that range from technical implementations to discourses on historical power imbalances. I think of it as deciding on a set of values for a product or a set of products or a company or whatever, and then making sure the product expresses and lives up to those values. So one of the really hard parts is defining those values and making sure that there's actually agreement and there's something you want to follow. But these are usually the typical pillars of our AI, or responsible AI, like fairness, safety, transparency, control, good governance, things like this. A lot of people do is, I'd like the RAI checklist. If you could give me the checklist of things I need to go do, I'll go do it. And the problem is a lot of it's not checklisty, and deeper than that, it's not supposed to be checklisty. So if you say, I need a checklist, and I say, no, what are your values? Those are two wildly different conversations, right? And a lot of our AI is intentionally reflective and intentionally slow and intentionally not checkboxy. And that is counterculture to a lot of things in product. So one is defining those values. And I think that that's a challenge for people. I would suggest to start small. Like, don't try to create a grand, unified moral framework. If I'm aiming this conversation at product builders or designers or UXers or researchers who are at smaller places that are going to be a lot more resource constrained and don't have a large user base yet, I would say start narrow and pick something you're not going to waffle on, and then figure out how it's going to be expressed in the product. But then the next part is, how are you going to know? And so a lot of people might say, we stand for blank, or we really believe in fairness. And it's like, okay, how are you going to know if your product is fair or not? And which ways do you want it to be fair? What's really relevant about fairness in your particular domain? Because it might vary if it's like in healthcare versus mortgages versus, showing people videos of cats or whatever it might be. And then how will you watch and listen and monitor to that? Both quantitatively, like, so how will you see it in your data? But then qualitatively, like, how will you be talking to your customers and users and understanding if fairness is showing up in a strong way for them? So that's really like how I think about responsible AI. And I mentioned transparency, and that's transparency of a lot of different kinds. But one of the big ones there also is data transparency. You asked about that. And so data transparency can be for a couple different audiences. Usually people talk about it in terms of the end user, but when I was at Meta for a short time, I actually was on the team that focused on some of their public data efforts and showing that researchers and journalists and people like that can get at. But usually what people mean is that, when the people who use your product give you some data about themselves, right? They've agreed to pass along some kind of data or information about themselves. And so for data transparency, there's oftentimes, this is a very rich field, but it can kind of boil down to a couple questions as well. One, are people aware of the data they're giving you? They should be, you'd want to be. If they agree to give you their data, is the benefit clear to them? There's times where I'm asked for data and the value to me is extremely unclear. So why would I give that to them? And so a lot of times the way it's done poorly is people are like, there's some kind of consent or terms of service or whatever that says, give us your data now. We promise we'll do something good with it in the future at some undisclosed time, and you may not realize it or not, but we promise we're going to do that. And if you're building a product, you tend to think of yourself as the good guys, and like you're trying to do well and you're trying to make something of value for people. But it's a pretty bad proposition for people. Another one is, does the benefit actually show up for them? So this is part of the trick with a lot of the AI stuff or the machine learning stuff. It's hard to express the value where you say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to take your data, and we may use it as an explicit signal in some kind of model tuning, or we may use it as a way to kind of think about new features, but we'll never really be able to tie it back to exactly the data you gave, or you're part of this huge aggregate we're going to look at. And so I think you need to be able to explain that, or at least clarify to people, like, should they see something really different right away? So another one is if you're in a feed of some kind, and there's a lot of times now, most of the feeds on Meta or Google or whoever, they have see more, see less of something. And so there's a big thing there of like, are you actually going to show them a benefit, and do they see the benefit right away? And do you communicate that? Is it clear to people the data that you have from them? Can they go check that somewhere? Like, can I go look and see what kind of data that you have about me? And then the last and really important one is can I control that? So if I go and I say, oh, I didn't actually realize you had my location data for the past 6 months. I'm not sure why you're recording that. Can I delete it? Or, I can't delete it, but can I request that you delete it? And do you have a policy where you will delete it? So I can remain in control of my data, so I can make sure I know it's being collected, I'm benefiting from it, I can see that benefit. I know what's there, and I can get rid of it if I don't want you to have it anymore.
Thank you. I've been researching quite a bit use cases related to data and AI. And what I keep coming back to is that people have an expectation that this is going to be a magic wand to give me exactly what I want, when I want it, how I want it, without the things that I don't want, just hyper personal. But the
Yeah.
paradox here is that to get the most value out of Gen AI, you need to be comfortable sharing as much data about yourself as possible. And in fairness, is that exclusionary? Is that human centered? Is it business centered? I'm really trapped in trying to figure out whether these products are inclusive, whether we've departed from human centricity. What do you think?
Yeah. I want to start with a rant really quickly. So I hate sparkles and I hate purple gradients. And everything, like just literally in the UI now, everything is, I think it's the worst idea possible to be like, we're going to do sparkles everywhere and we're going to do purple gradients. Everything's purple gradients. And I'm not just being a hater to be a hater. I think it's a horrible promise for exactly the reasons you just gave. It's like, oh, I pressed the magic button. All right, then I expect magic. I don't expect like kind of better than what was there or maybe a new experience. And I think it's just a horrible overpromise. And then the purple gradients is just, it's like, come on, people. I get it. It's purple gradients, it's a little sci-fi. Sure. But we'll get there. We're gonna evolve out of this little phase very quickly. So yeah, I think that this is one of the biggest dangers of the hype cycle. And to actually call back to the People Plus AI guidebook, there's a major update. The guidebook comes out in 2019, but there was a big update in 2021. And the central update was around calibrated trust. So a lot of times people are like, how can we have people trust us more, trust our product more? And it's like, well, you don't want to overtrust things because overtrusting can be really dangerous as well. And you don't want to undertrust things because then you don't get the whole value that you potentially could. You want to calibrate your trust to the right place possible. And so I think that this is one of the dangers of the hype cycle, both on both sides. When you're overpromising, obviously there's going to be a big letdown. You might have people trust it for reasons they really shouldn't. And if you underhype it, then people really aren't getting the value that they could get. And their lives could be a lot better that way. And so when it comes to the data part about that, then I still think it comes back to this. It's this trade-off and this fair value exchange, right? Is like, I'm fine giving data as long as I'm getting a commensurate benefit. Now, in some ways where people are sharing data, there may not be any commensurate benefit. If somebody was like, I want to track every one of your biosignals and I want to save it in a database forever and I want to share it with the public and whoever wants to see it, I'm like, I don't know what you could offer me to accept that deal. It's a really, really bad deal. So one is this commensurate value, and I just don't think people are really delivering it right now. I think the other part, though, is to do more around on-device processing of data and not having to share it in detailed forms or being able to share it in anonymized formats. And this is something actually my former team at Google pushed on for years. They were years ahead of this. And now you're seeing a lot of it. And like most, not to date the podcast, but with Apple's recent announcements, that was a really big thing they're pushing, right? It's that we're going to do almost everything we can on device, and then we're going to bump it to the cloud only when possible. And so to connect that as well, is I think that that's where you're seeing the frontier models get a lot of the press because it's the most interesting headlines, right? It's like, oh, this model passed the LSAT or whatever, which actually when you dig in and people try to replicate, they can't. But one of the things that I think is you're going to see a big rise of are these much smaller models that can operate much more efficiently in terms of compute and energy on the device. And so that's going to lower the amount of data that I need to give up there. Now, the third part of your question was really about human centricity. And I think this then always just comes back to, is it solving a problem I have or creating a new opportunity for me that I really enjoy? Or is it, well, the technology can do this, so we're just going to like have it kind of bluntly do this thing. But again, I think you're starting to see the integration into the platforms where Meta and, actually Meta, Google, Microsoft, and Apple now are all doing much deeper integrations into products that are already trying to solve people's problems in a human-centered way, and AI is going to hopefully accelerate that. One of the ways you frame that is it seems business-centered. Like, I would actually say it seems tech-centered, because a lot of them don't seem to have a business model yet. It's not like they're like, ooh, there's a big pile of money over here, and we're going to go grab that money. It's kind of like, we have a technology, and we hope it won't incinerate as much money in the future, or maybe create money in the future. It's a very tech-centered moment.
Yeah. The next question was going to be about the fact that people are really trying to utilize this tech for things like therapy and customer service. It's like we're trying to push people to more of these tech-centered conversations rather than conversations with real people, which seems like we're sort of veering past the era of human centricity.
I do think it's interesting to see these people expanding on the anthropomorphic nature of the technology and saying like, oh, it can do this, in finger quotes, because usually it can't. I'll be generous and say yet, but there's no real examination of, and this comes back to the RAI stuff of like, should it do that? Or do people want it to do that? And I think that the answer is generally pretty varied as well. One of the things that I've learned doing user research and listening to people, not headlines or what other people trying to shape a conversation have to say, is you do realize that there are a lot of use cases that people are really benefiting from that give some other people kind of the ick or the heebie-jeebies, or like they don't get it. And it's like, okay, but this person is really benefiting from this. And so when you talk about a lot of these use cases that are foundationally about humans talking to humans, and those getting replaced or potentially replaced with bots and bots driven by models, it's interesting because I actually think we could see a big backfire for a lot of people. So I could see a lot of companies trying to move these to human to AI conversations versus human to human. And I could actually see that being a big backfire and everybody saying, why is everyone hating this? Our customers say we don't want it, and we actually need to shift back to that. And so then you have to go actually talk to your customers again, which is actually more human-centered than not. I also think like the errors and problems in those use cases will be really obvious and very existential for those businesses. I think that they'll actually probably struggle really, really hard if they're not very human-centered in their approach to begin with. And for what it's worth, I do a bit of investing and advising, and there's probably a selection bias here, but everyone that I've talked to that's kind of in that realm is being quite thoughtful about this and has no intention of disrupting human-to-human connections or things like that. I think one of the other things that we're going to see is we're about to understand the premium on human-to-human interaction. The reality is I don't want to talk to a person for everything. I always say I'm extroverted for tech. So like I actually like talking to people and going on podcasts and stuff like that. But there's plenty of times where I don't. Like a canonical example is I'd much rather fill out a form online than call somebody and have to have them fill out a paper and pencil. It doesn't mean I'm antisocial or I'm not human-centered. It's just a thing where I'm like, yeah, that had to be human-centered, and now it doesn't. And so I think we're going to find out where people actually put a premium there. And one of the ways that I always think about this and frame it is there's this old thinking of in cybernetics, right? And it's the human use of human beings. And it's more like, well, we took a bunch of jobs and we made them robotic. We made them formulaic. We made people follow a script. And then it's pretty easy to then have a robot take them over. So we formed jobs into these forms that were easily automatable. And so that's more a collective choice of what do we want automated or taken over and what do we not. But automation also brings the price down of everything. And so sometimes when people are like, it's more human-centered to do this thing, it's well for the people who can afford it, for sure. I don't want to end with it's complicated, but I do see it through a couple of those different lenses.
Now, you and I are both researchers at our core, and I feel like there's this philosophical gap right now because the majority of product teams, they have this philosophy, which is we solve problems, reduce friction. This is the path to revenue. Now, what I've encountered, particularly when researching emerging tech, is it's much harder than that because quite simply put, if you're always looking at problems, you're not looking at value drivers, and value drivers are more important. Some problems people like to have, some problems you want to keep. So like, let's take, for example, cooking. Did takeout and delivery replace cooking? No, it replaced social interactions that you would have had otherwise outside of your home, because cooking is a sacred act. It's a sacred thing you do. Nothing will ever replace it, really. And this is one of the dangers of trying to automate quote unquote problems. You might actually be unintendedly replacing something that was an important part of humanity, or how a business operates, or the channels through which we build value. So I guess at the base of this, I'm wondering how philosophically you research value drivers and problems to make sure that you're actually seeking out what matters to people and what benefits them.
One, I love that. I love that way of approaching it. Yeah, I try to think of it as, I can't remember who the quote's from, but it's a good one. Is, you don't sell a product, you sell people a better version of themselves. And I think there's a cynical and optimistic version of that. But yeah, I try to think about, who are people trying to become, and how can we help them become that kind of person? And hopefully for people aspiring to great things. And so we used to do some research like this where, when you're working on fundamental technology, it's very hard to get feedback on the capability. You can't ask people like, well, what would you do if you could recognize objects through your camera, like out in the real world? People will be like, I don't know, I guess I'd ask about this bug or whatever, just kind of the first kind of silly things come. And so one of the approaches that we took just a few years ago is we would do sessions, and we would start, and we wouldn't talk about technology at all. We would talk about two different timelines for people. We would talk about their aspirations for 3 years. Because it's interesting when you ask people about their aspirations, you have to hit this middle ground. Because if you ask too close in the future, it's kind of like just today, just a little bit better. But if you ask too far out, it's flying cars and everything's perfect, and I hope I have it all solved. And so we'd ask people, I think it was in the 2 to 5 range. And we would ask them across the spectrum of their lives, like, what are their goals? What are your aspirations? Where do you want to be in your life? And then we would talk to them tell us about the last couple of days and your technology use and things like that. And then we would introduce technologies really broadly in terms of a capability, sometimes through like a more tailored example. But then we would bring people back and we would say, do you think that this could help you in achieving any of your goals or your aspirations? And if so, how? The technology is then really linked to something somebody already expressed to you about where they're trying to go in their life. And then also it spawns a bunch of other great conversations, because then they're like, yeah, I don't really need that, but what I actually need is this other thing. And you're like, awesome. As a researcher, as a product person, that's gold. That's what I want. But to your point, I think that's how I think about, you talk about value drivers, and I think I relate to it a little, we're probably using the same name for something a little different. I think about these like aspirations or aspirational self, or how do you help people on their journey?
I know we've been talking for a while. It's been so helpful. I love this conversation so much. But what are some products or projects that you're excited about today that you can share with us?
Yeah, I think so. One is, I always tell people, sometimes people ask me like, how do you stay up on everything that's going on? I'm like, oh, I don't. And don't worry, nobody does. So if you feel like, oh my God, I don't know everything that's going on, don't worry, nobody does. And if they tell you they do, I wouldn't trust them anymore. Yeah, there's a couple of things that I'm really excited about that I'll kind of maybe run through. I mentioned kind of the text expansion contraction. That's just going to be useful if you're in Microsoft Office, or if you're writing comments on Meta, or if you're trying to get something done in Google Docs, or whatever you're doing. I think that's going to be big. And so I don't want to gloss over the practical things, because sometimes people zoom past that. A couple maybe a little bit more fun, or like, whoa, there's something there. I've been a really big fan of a company called Runway, or Runway ML, for a long time. And they're creating a new way of self-expression and a new camera, if you will. I think that's truly what they're doing. They're really doing some amazing stuff with generated video. But one of the things I think that's really impressive about what they're doing is they have a real vertical integration in their approach. So they're training their own models and tuning their own models, and they have the whole stack. And then they're also just working really closely with their community, and they always have. When people talk about, oh, we don't want these tools to replace people or replace anyone, okay, well then work with those communities from the beginning. And Runway's been committed to that. And they just had a new update that's very impressive. Another one is Consensus. And so Consensus is really focusing on helping people with academic research. So it is kind of the general, like, help me see the commonalities between these documents, summarize this thing for me, but it's focused into a really great use case around academic research. And it's just extremely handy to get an abstracted or a summarized, but still in depth, if you want it, view of a field. And so it's a great way to learn about new areas. A third I find super fascinating is Perplexity. So Perplexity has been doing, one of the things I think is so interesting about Perplexity, so you can ask it any question, just like any of the other bots. But I think they've done two things that I'm really fascinated by. One is their loop. So they will notify you once a day, and they'll generate a little summary of the top news articles of that day. And it's a really brilliant way that they've found a retention loop, where a lot of people, a lot of the chatbots and some of the other companies, they really struggle with just getting people to come back. You go, you see the chat box, it says, ask me anything. I ask it something. That was cool. And then I go, and I don't come back to it. They've kind of figured out that, like, oh, there will be news every single day. People want a little summary of it. We can provide that for them. It's a really great loop. It's going to help you create pages. I think they're called pages on Perplexity. Those are three. I think the fourth and fifth are kind of connected. I still think everyone's really obsessed with the consumer stuff, takes precedent, but the AI augmented science is massive and enormous. And a lot of this is coming out of DeepMind, right? They've been really committed to this. Everything with AlphaFold is just, this is shaking the scientific foundations over here. And then the biggest one to me is it's only going to play a role, but it might be a very essential role in nuclear fusion. And I keep telling people, if AI, for the people that hate on AI or whatever, if it's a critical piece that gets nuclear fusion working, like the rest of it's a freaking rounding error. Like, who cares what else it does at that point? And these are just really energizing topics and companies and stuff that I try to stay on top of. I let a lot of the other stuff go so I can know a little bit more about them.
Yeah, those are wonderful. I think drug discovery too. There's so many really interesting use cases for AI, and I love the way that you describe that. And I agree with all of the tools that you chose. We actually had someone on discussing a case study a couple of weeks ago that was focused all on Runway and the uses for anonymizing biometric data in user interviews. So super cool that you brought that up too. So finally, are there any resources that you'd like to share for listeners to learn more about your research and just about responsible AI in general?
Yeah, just three I would call out. One is I mentioned a couple times, the People Plus AI guidebook. I think that's a big one. We'll include a link to it, but I think that's the starting place for a lot of people. I think another one that I don't think people know as much about is Meta has this thing called Meta Content Library, and it replaced a previous program called CrowdTangle. This comes back to the data transparency part. If you're a researcher or a journalist or something like that, like you can access a lot of the data that Meta has, like on viewership and ads, and it's all anonymized and everything like that. But that can be a really useful research tool if you're really interested in social media and studying that. The last one, just to kind of push the envelope a little bit, is Meta, we did this thing called a community forum, which is a new kind of, I kind of think of it as a new kind of research method for a lot of UX researchers. And it's an exercise in deliberative democracy. And we did this with Stanford. And so a lot of times in user research, we don't want people to know anything about a product before we come in and we kind of get their fresh take on it and everything like that. But this was a community forum we brought together of a demographically representative sample that reflected Meta's user base on its platforms to really discuss Gen AI and talk about how they want Gen AI to be implemented and work. And so at the beginning of the session, we educate people on the topic. So we say, like, this is Gen AI, this is how it works, here's how it's showing up. You have people kind of like vote on a couple different topics, things like, should AI models behave differently depending on which country they're deployed in or something like that. They spend some hours of the day actually debating with each other about these topics. So you get a discourse, you get a conversation, people evolve their thinking, and then they kind of vote at the end as well. And so this is all public as well, linked to the final report. But it's fascinating to me to see research really exploring these different ways of getting feedback at these very different scales, right? It's not one person. It's trying to sample, how do you engage users when your platforms serve billions of people on these massive topics about new technologies, and these community forums or these deliberative democracy approaches are one of those ways.
It's been so wonderful having you, and it's especially rewarding knowing that there's such thoughtful people leading some of these initiatives at the big companies. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. This has been really fun. Yeah, the time flew by.
Thank you for listening to the Design of AI podcast. The show is hosted by Brittany Hobbs and RP Drake Figueredo. Subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple to get our latest episodes. We speak to leaders at the forefront of AI to learn how great AI products are designed and how they're transforming industries. To contact us, visit our website, designof.ai.